Good evening. We're all gathered here for a lecture as part of the lecture series organized by Foundation for Creative Social Research titled Indian Political Thought, the Idea and Its Challenges. The speaker for today's session is Professor Gurpreet Mahajan, retired professor and an inspiring, passionate teacher to most of us from Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. Currently serving as a Robert Schumann Fellow at the European University Institute in Florence. Her publications include Explanation and Understanding in Human Sciences 1992, Identities and Rights Aspects of Liberal Democracy in India 1998, The Multicultural Path, Issues of Diversity and Discrimination in Democracy 2002, and India Political Ideas and the Making of a Democratic Discourse 2013. The chair for the session is Professor Manoranjan Mohanty, former chairperson and director of ICS and a former editor of China Report. He has had visiting assignments in several universities and research institutes in India and abroad, and has also been with the Council for Social Development, and until recently was the editor of the CST journal Social Change, published by SAGE. Before beginning the session, I would request everyone present to stay muted for the duration of the talk. We will have a Q&A after comments from the chair and respondents. For the Q&A, please raise your hand and we will go one by one as the queue proceeds. Thank you. I will now request Professor Mohanty to give the introductory remarks.
Well, thank you. I was struck by the fact that no reference was made to my 40 years of teaching in Delhi University.
Sorry, sir. I will keep that in mind next time.
And what is important is, on most of the occasions these days, that is missing always, sometimes, very often. And, the reason data of this meeting and the context of this whole group is our association through many, many efforts over decades in Delhi University. So please, Sakshi and your comrades, please look into history of the ideas behind the critical group that this is, behind the creative theory colloquium.
Yes,
But
sir.
I'm very pleased to be part of this meeting, as I was saying, under some difficult circumstances. For two reasons. One, I think this is, I wanted to be associated with this effort to really honor a scholar of Gurpreet's standing, who has influenced a whole generation of students, teachers, and thought processes in India. So that's the main reason why I'm here, to say thank you, Gurpreet, for what you have done at the CPS all these decades. The second reason is the topic. What brought me to Delhi University and not to follow my predecessors to Allahabad from Odisha was a paper called Political Ideas in Modern India. And I was so fed up with my political science honors in Ravindra College, with the way political thought was taught by excellent teachers, but the structure of that course. When I thought, oh, there is a course called Political Ideas in Modern India, so I came to Delhi, and I was stuck. And so 50 years later, 55 exactly, 62, 59 years later, I find that there is someone who has a book with such a title, and I have to repeat that: India, Political Ideas and the Making of a Democratic Discourse. But I will come back to this topic later, maybe at the end, because I don't want to take too much time. But I must say that when we changed the title of this course to Political Thought in Modern India, the then head of the department, Arnam Singh, and many other teachers, except on this thing. They objected. They said, India has no political thought. You can only have study political ideas. And it has been a battle since. The entire teaching politics journal, the group, the DCRC, its Rasan data, had been oriented towards efforts and debates on three questions. Not seeking indigenous knowledge, no, but having a concept of history of knowledge, that all people in all parts of the globe are repositories of knowledge, cultures, traditions, and civilizations which deserve to be recognized, understood. And I'm so happy in that frame. There are many strands in Gurpreet's book. I have not had a thorough study of the book, I must confess, but my very quick reading of the book convinced me that there are lots of resources in this book which can be used for those of us, and last 15 years I have been part of the Bandung network, also trying to engage in knowledge discourses on various topics. During the last, during the last few years, the Bandung network has, been very structured, and some of you know already about it, and more about that later. So it's not about indigenous versus universal. It is really trying to cope with the colonial constraints on knowledge, seeking knowledge. And Gurpreet very well tries to indicate those constraints and methods of overcoming them. It's really about what kind of efforts went on that resulted in the Indian Constitution. It's the values, the ideas, and the practices, and all their contradictions and conflicts. So making up the democratic discourse is the key part. And then you go back to Vivekananda, Gandhi, Tilak, and Aurobindo, Ambedkar, Nehru, all that. So, so I'm very pleased that the intellectual exercise, which has been at the very foundation of the creative theory colloquium, now 3 generations, Manindra and his students, has benefited a lot from the scholarship and teaching of Gurpreet, and therefore I thought, no matter what, I will be present. So with these words, let me welcome Gurpreet, and we wish you many more decades of similar scholarship and continuing to influence Indian democratic discourse. Thank you. Gurpreet now.
Thank you very much, Professor Mohanty, for those very kind and generous words, because we know that the people who have shaped the discipline of political science and also the discourse of political science in India compelled generations of students, including me. I was never directly his student, but you never need to be directly a student. I have engaged with him, heard him, been part of the various discussion forums he set up from time to time to imbibe many of those influences, including the emphasis on the context and so on and so forth. There is much that I have learned from you, Professor Manti, so your words really mean a great deal. So my thank you to the foundation for inviting me. And really, I don't know much about all the work that the Foundation for Creative Research, etc. is doing, but the word creative is in my mind really associated with Professor Mohanty. because years ago in the mid 80s, when this discussion was going on about doing something called Indian political thought or Indian political theory, this is the phrase creative theory, something that Professor Mohanty presented. And I maybe on another occasion, I'll talk about the context in which that emerged and what we associated with it, but I'll have occasion to come back to it. So there is much agreement, but thank you for this invitation, and thank you to PK and Anuradha for being here, because as far as I'm concerned, in a seminar, perhaps I have a little to give, only a few ideas to share with you, but I'm looking forward to receiving a lot more and seeing how it resonates with people who have been engaged in these fields for a long period of time. I'm not going to really talk about different elements in the book, though that was the suggestion initially. I'm going to talk about just the first few pages and what went into the thinking about that and planning about it. And that's what I want to really share, because I think despite the discussion on this particular subject of Indian political theory or Indian political thought or ideas, we'll come to those distinctions maybe later, perhaps only in the discussion. There are some constants which keep haunting and coming up. And I just thought that maybe I don't need the 40 minutes that have been allotted to me. I need much less. I have a simple, straightforward argument to make. And that really has two dimensions to it. One is that as post-colonials, we are caught in a very peculiar dilemma. And that's something I think most of us recognize. There is, on the one hand, the inescapable experience of colonialism, of being subjugated or being considered and treated as less than equal. And all those phrases, people without the capacity to govern themselves and lacking reflective abilities, almost like Aristotelian slaves and so on and so forth. So it's from that experience, whether we were directly experiencing it ourselves or not. Don't know. Somebody has written, please, in Hindi. I'm not sure I can be bilingual.
No, Gurpreet, carry on, please. Please carry on.
Okay. Maybe I can say some things later on in the discussion in Hindi. So there is this experience of being colonized, and that has left a deep mistrust of Western categories of representation and thinking, because we assume, and we do believe, and there is truth in it, that some of those categories were elaborated in modes by which we were being subjugated and colonized and governed. Add to it the fact that we know, and this is an understanding that has come to us from theories in the West itself, that ideology plays a crucial role in governing populations. That it's not only by brute force or violence that the colonizers, that the British Raj established and embedded itself in India, but it created a way of thinking which could assist it in this particular task. So there is the entire paraphernalia of ideology, of ideas at work. And therefore, there is this second dimension of mistrust that is there, that have we been colonized? So there was the phrase in the 80s that was being used so frequently, there is colonization of the mind that has taken place. And perhaps we need to break free from that, and we need to liberate ourselves. And I think terms like Swaraj, etc., were used in order to talk about how do we challenge that colonization of the mind, though it's difficult to pinpoint exactly what that was. And I think the quest for the Indian element, the Indian political thought or Indian whatever, really emerged in that particular context as a way of really challenging and overthrowing those categories of Western political thought, which were really instrumental in the project of colonization, and looking for something which can be a source of our own liberation, etc., etc. So there is this one dimension to the entire project of thinking about this particular element. And we have, this is not something new. It's not, in the 80s, of course, there was a great deal, or I should say since the 1980s, there was a lot of discussion about this, about what can be the nature of Indian political theory and what kind of political theory and what kinds of categories should we use, etc. Nudged by Professor Parikh's paper, which some of you might recall, we talked about the poverty of Indian political theory, and that there isn't, of course, he meant there is no normative political theory that we are doing. But given that aside, I think the urge to think in terms of something which was Indian really emerged in this particular context, and this was inevitably the push that we had in moving in that direction. The dilemma, however, is that the moment we thought of thinking in terms of something called Indian political thought, inevitably we confronted the question which we had to deal with: what constitutes that Indian? And little traditions, the big tradition, and so on and so forth. I'm not going to dwell on that issue because I think some of those, some part of that issue can be dealt with more easily. To me, the more serious limitation or dilemma really was that whenever we looked for something that constituted Indian, inevitably the Indian was thought of and represented in cultural terms. So ethnos was really looking for some kind of cultural foundation. So culturological explanations were really thought of. And I'm thinking of 4 or 5 different kinds of issues and problems that emerged as a consequence of it. First is the notion of uniqueness or authenticity. Because when you're saying Indian, you're saying something which is distinctly Indian, ours, as distinct from or as separated from that which belongs to others. So you are thinking of uniqueness almost as a path that has not been traversed, or categories which you find here and here alone, and which connect with people, of course. But this is something that we associate with the notion of uniqueness. And I think eventually I would argue that that notion of uniqueness is something which itself is very problematic. One of the simplest examples of this really is that when scholars, and I'm not saying just political scientists, social scientists, thought in terms of that which is uniquely Indian, which has stayed with us for many, many years, invariably the gaze rested on the category of caste. It seemed to be something which is very unique and so on and so forth to India. Though this is not the only category, but you can see a whole scholarship that emerged around this particular idea, because when you're looking for uniqueness in cultural terms, well, this is a category that came up immediately. But as I said, the search for something quintessentially Indian, which we can use as a foil against the colonial, the Western colonial, is not a new concern. It was there in the political leaders of the national movement. So you have many people from in 20th century, Aurobindo, Vivekananda, Gandhi, all of them in some ways really thinking in terms of what would be that mode of thinking, etc. And we know the other categories Radhakrishnan came up with spirituality, that there is this element of spiritualism which is really uniquely Indian, because that's the central pivot around which life or community is really woven around. Then there were other points of view that emerged, that in the West, the central category is the individual, respect for law and institutions of law. And in India, we have notions of collectivity. And, which also means that we don't have a similar kind of easy adherence to or obeisance to the law. The point really is that in many of these ways of thinking about Indianness, or what is Indian, and locating it in the cultural, you find that you end up with almost like a Louis Dumont kind of distinction. Hierarchy here, equality there. So you have these kinds of counterfoils that are represented. Then you had another alternate way of thinking about the Indian, which really gained much more popularity in the 1990s. And that is where we thought in terms of, let's look at the languages of India. Because language is a mode of communication, cultural dissemination, communication, etc. So there was a discussion about And here we were looking for Indian, that we should be really focused on concepts and categories that are present in that particular language. So you had a whole range of discussions about the word state not being present in vernacular languages and what were the equivalents, were they better, and so on and so forth, etc. And you know the discussion that has taken place around the term secularism around it, that it is something which is not indigenous to India, it's something that happens and comes in a different context, etc., etc. I'm just signposting this because you can see that every time we search for that which is Indian, and we invariably are pushed towards thinking of it in these kinds of terms, more cultural, what I call culturological terms, a range of difficulties really emerge. Keep in mind a further element, that we are engaged, and by the 80s, 90s, it's very clear we want to create a tradition of Indian political thought, or traditions in the plural of Indian political thought. And as I said, this Indian versus something else, etc., etc. So against the Western, which was really the opposition we had in mind. It's not Asian that is figuring in the imagination at that time, though it has entered into the picture now. But let's leave that aside. Keep in mind, I think there are some benefits of coming to this exercise of thinking about traditions of Indian political thought so late in the day. Because the canon of Western political thought is a construct of the 19th century. It's in the 19th century, Whig historiography takes up this project and thinks in terms of the origin of concepts that they regard to be very significant, which they have arrived at. And then they go back and think about concepts, where did it all emerge? Democracy, citizenship, participation, rights. And they go back to the Greeks and Romans selectively. And this creates all kinds of, and we have become aware of it, and everybody knows this by now, that this leads to all kinds of errors in representation. For instance, you would remember when I was a student, Sabine and Dunning and stuff like that was really what people were looking at when they looked at the history of Western political thought. And in those texts, as in many others, even today, whenever the discussion on democracy emerges, people go back to Aristotle, knowing fully well that even though Aristotle did not have any sympathy for a democratic form of organization, and what kind of democratic organization are we talking about when you believe in natural inequality of all persons? So you are not thinking of that. So I think you begin to, when you start looking for origins, and that is the quest. This is something that happens, and I think we have something to learn from the mistakes of the West here. When they constructed traditions of political thought, they were looking for where did these kinds of ideas which define the West today around democracy and rights and freedom come from, which were the first representations of it. And there are errors which Quentin Skinner talks about when you read texts out of their context, that you have errors of this kind. You begin to see little words here and there and construct a full theory out of it. And I used Aristotle as an example, but we could think of many others similarly. You begin to really read too much in things that were just mentioned in passing, or really was part of a conglomerate of concepts which have no relationship with the totality that we are talking about today when we talk about democracy or freedom or rights, etc., etc. So I think this is the other element we need to be careful about, that when we are thinking in terms of, one, of course, is the culturological element, the notion of Indianness as completely unique and authentic, what is authentically ours. And the third element is that when we are thinking in terms of tradition, constructing a tradition, keep in mind that when we begin to think of traditions in terms of beginning from the present and reading into the past, where did these notions come? And we've had things of this kind. Where did the notion of democracy come? Is it something alien to India? Is it there? Where do you find it? And you find it in the Buddhist Sangha, or you find it in many other experiences. I think there are these concerns that we need to be careful about. when we are dealing with and looking for something which is authentically ours and saying that these things existed here. I would also like to add to it the difficulty that, as I mentioned, the word state doesn't exist, but can we think in terms of, or do we need to wait for Rawls to tell us that an idea can exist even though an equivalent, the same terminology or words are not there? So you may not have the articulation of a concept, but the ideas may very much be in there. So I think these are the set of issues that I wanted, which I find were problematic when we were thinking and doing Indian political thought. And they stemmed around this desire to look for, Professor Mohanty mentioned that it wasn't indigenous, but I think in Professor Mohanty's mind, it was very clear it is not going to be something which is going to be narrowly native and indigenous, because that's a difficult term. But for many others, and work that was produced around that time and debates that did take place, were focused on these kinds of concerns. So my concern really was that I have not spelled out all the limitations, because many of the limitations of these frames of thinking are, I think, by now known to most people and everybody here. I'm sure you had occasion to talk about, discuss them. So I thought that maybe one needs to really think in terms of doing Indian political thought or theory differently. With the different starting point, differently in the sense with a different starting point. And I wanted to move away, and I wanted to say that culture or cultural logical elements are not the good starting point there, because when you are looking for that kind of location, other than the fact that you are going to be essentializing culture, and we need to recognize that even if there is continuity, there is also a change in the culture. So culture is not, or being part of a cultural group, or for being practicing, being a participant in a culture, is not what the Wittgensteinians call a mode of rule following. Every time you do the same thing, you do it slightly differently, and not all, everybody may not do it, but some people may do it. And you have only to look at, look at the attire which we wear today. And I think there is nothing, this is not to be something which can be trapped into and should not be trapped into, whether it's cultural or not. And I'm thinking, forget our daily attire. Think of marriages and ceremonies, which are, much where ritual is important, where certain kinds of cultural enactment is going on all the time, and we are part of it. What was what colors were worn and what colors are worn today, and the manner in which they are worn today, there is change. People keep introducing a little bit by little bit. And I keep saying this often in many things, that if, let's say, red was or white was the color you wore, then, green borders came in, then the blue came in, then the design became different. And today, of course, you have, every day I turn on the news on my phone, and then I see let's say, video goes viral of a bride dancing in her own, on her own wedding. And who knows, in 100 years from now, there will be this cultural play where this will be a very important part of the marriage ceremony. The point I want to make really is that being part of a culture is not like rule following, where you keep doing things in exactly, dot for dot, bit by bit, exactly the same thing. There is always, and I want to use, with your permission, Professor Mohanty, a creative interaction and construction and participation in culture. And I think if creative theory had a meaning to me, it is something like this, that there is always a creative and reflective, both creative, the reflective process also, and sometimes even not reflective, it could be by emotion and passion and so on and so forth. There is a creative engagement as members of that particular culture. So I want to begin with the starting point that we need to recognize that culture is not a mode of rule following. There is always a creative engagement. And I want to introduce the second element here, that this creativity is at work due to the way in which we, as members of a culture, participate. But there are also other resources that are available to us, and we cannot deny them in the post-industrial age, where communications have increased, multiplied much quicker, more readily available, that you are aware of ideas that are, and modes of living and everydayness that are, are being, that are part and parcel of people's life elsewhere. So your creative process really also imbibes that particular element. So you have both these things. So in a nutshell, and I'm really now towards the concluding part of what I wanted to say, a few things. For me, the better and more desirable starting point of thinking about whatever we want to call it, Indian political thought or etc., is to think of it being, make the historical the central category, not the culture, which has these problems of essentializing and giving it a core, and then the interpretations of that essential come into play, but the historical. Now, when I say historical, I should clarify. It does not mean really thinking in terms of the record of the past and going back to it. It does not also imply explaining, what happened before as the cause of what is happening now. So building these kinds of connections between what came before and what came after. I think these are the most commonplace notions of the historical, which are deeply, deeply problematic. And if you owe something to the entire tradition of historical thinking, and I do owe it to the Western world, and I think there is no harm in thinking about and recognizing that debt, it has made one think that to think historically is to recognize that the past is never completely dead and gone. It is there with us. Some part of it is there with us, but the past we carry with us is a mediated past. And this mediation element needs to be recognized, that it is mediated, it is something which is appropriated, selectively presented, represented, rehearsed, as I said, in these many creative forms and given to us. But we do carry it with us. So there is this kind of connection. We need to recognize that, but recognize that it's not to be treated as something which is essentialized, cultural, and to be represented in these terms. Instead, recognize that it's changing. It is mediated, so the way it is presented to us today is different from the way in which it was understood and represented 100 years ago or 20 years ago. So there is, as it were, a kind of continuous fusion of horizons. I'm using Gadamer's phrase rather eclectically here, that there is this mediation in the way the past is being presented to us, the way we take it, and then there is a creative engagement with it. The second point I want to emphasize here, and that's the other element that I had in mind when I did the book, was that we should recognize that there is a kind of dual temporal space that we, all of us, inhabit as individuals, as historical beings. We often say that we stand in history, and I keep thinking, what does it mean to stand in history? And I think there are these two elements to it. There is that creative, mediated past which we carry with us in different ways. That is one element of being historical. The other element, the space that we occupy, is that we are living in a particular age which is defined by centrality to certain concepts. And I think the modern world has given centrality to some notions of, it's not that some of those ideas were not there earlier, but the combination in which they have come to play an important role today in terms of equality of all persons along with their individual subjective freedoms. I think these are organizing ideas of our historical world. We are also members not just of our creative cultural world, but also members of this historical world. And these ideas have a resonance, no matter, and that is why they are really the zeitgeist. This is the spirit of the age in which they have a resonance in many different ways to different people. Not all those ideas, some of them. And I think that is something that we need also to recognize. So when we are thinking of Indian, we need to think of a kind of dialectic between the two, that we have those ideas which have marked our time, our historical world, and being in history, we are bound to be engaging with them, and those which have come from our mediated past, and that's where the fusion really emerges. Now this leads me, and I think there's no clearer example of this. I think the political leadership of the national movement, the modern Indian political thought that Professor Mohanty was referring to, had, as it were, and they may not have written about it, but I think they had an intuitive understanding of this dualism, of these two moments of what it means to be a historical being. So you'll find if you read them and you turn to their speeches, they move easily, fluently, without any stumbling, as it were, from freedom to Swaraj to other kinds of ideas. Because it doesn't matter. The provenance of that concept doesn't matter. What matters is what meaning they are going to give it in the context in which they are, and what do they want it to be combined with. So to my mind, when I want to engage in or even construct traditions of political thought, which I didn't, I chose ideas for a different reason, I might come to it later on. We need to begin with this understanding that this is what it means to be a historical person, and we do this. So there are concepts which may not really appear uniquely our own because these concepts are used elsewhere. But what is unique is the manner in which we use them, the meaning we imbued them with, the issues that they came to represent for us, the direction that we took subsequently. Now, equality, for instance, may appear to be a concept which is used, we may not say that, we don't want to say, nobody wants to say that this is not part of their tradition. Of course, all traditions now claim equality to be central. All religious traditions also believe, philosophical traditions say in some form or the other that they do think in terms of equality as a central concept. But what does it really imply for us? Why is it that the conflict between freedom and equality, that one limiting the other, doesn't become central to India? It's not what is defining element of this constellation of concepts that we chose. This is not the issue that emerges. In fact, why is it that you do find an early representation of the connections between the social and the economic so well articulated in the Indian context? So concepts get imbued with, and that's the third dimension of the historical, that what really makes us unique is the manner in which we think, in the meaning we imbue the concepts with. The concepts come in a constellation of concepts, which are the other accompanying concepts which we regard to be significant and important. So never equality of individual, never equality of results. The terms that are used for Western discourses here, we are thinking in terms of equality between groups and so on and so forth. So we could be looking at, and there will be other ideas and maybe even representations of similar ideas which may exist elsewhere in ways through imaginations and through invocation of texts and ideas which are peculiar to India, and it may be through that, it may not be through that. And I think it doesn't make any difference really to what it means to be an Indian. I said that's my concluding comment, but one more, please, sorry. I think yes, Smriti Dhal, we'll talk about it later. I don't want to get distracted in the question. I am making a distinction between the cultural and the historical, and I think that's very, very significant because the cultural is always essentializing, this historical is always destabilizing. And that's one thing that we need always to keep in mind. So I've been a good student, Professor Mohanty, in recognizing that distinction. But let me come back to the final thing that I want, just two sentences. That I think the great danger, another danger that exists in talking about Indian political thought or Indian whatever, is that we don't want to be bracketed as the particular. Because when you look for uniqueness in that strong sense of the word, authenticity, the path never traveled elsewhere, just our own, and so on and so forth, which is our cultural path or whatever our path, then the possibility of your being placed in the domain of the particular, this is so specific to you that you lose out on being part of and shaping of the universal. And I think that's something that we need also to own and recognize, because if you look at the trajectory of what has happened today all over the globe, the development of processes of knowledge has been such that there is space now for bringing in Indian, Chinese, whatever else, other African modes of thought. But they are meant to be particular. while the universalizing aspect of theory and generalization still stays with the West. And I think that's something we need to challenge when we are doing Indian political thought. We need to own the space for the universal. Let me give you two straightforward, easy examples. When we think, the strange thing is that whenever people wanted to do Indian political thought, Gandhi became the world over the exemplar. Because anyway, the image of Gandhi invokes something which is so different from the image of human being as they are clad in the West, that it becomes Indian. But is it only of appearance? You think in terms of his actions, some particularly Indian, but some not so. Experiments with truth and writing and talking about it, one needs to put a question mark about, but we don't need to think about it. And I think the appeal of people like Gandhi is universal. And I think we need to own that space. So when we want to talk about Indian, let's not talk about it in terms of just pure particularity and uniqueness. We need to begin with the particular in order to insert ourselves and be part of that universal. And I think that's where people like Ambedkar come in. Now, of course, people are using Ambedkar as a voice of rebellion against a certain kind of hierarchy and so on and so forth. But I don't think it mattered to him which concepts he was using, because he was aiming, by talking about Indian social reality and what needs to be done there and what needs to be changed, to think in terms of universal principles, which could work here and elsewhere. And I think their appeal lies there. So that's the final thing I want to say, that let's think in terms of that. And that's why I find notions of authenticity, indigeneity, Indian, cultural, very, very limiting. They may have some potential elsewhere, but I want to take a different path because they have that particular potentiality. I think I've taken too much time already, so I will stop here. Maybe why ideas I will come to later another time. Thank you so much.
Professor Mohanty, you're muted.
Thank you so much, Gurpreet. I think that presented the argument very well, especially the difference between cultural and historical. Cultural leading to essentializing, historical destabilizing and challenging. Thank you very much. And several important aspects you have stated. And now we have two wonderful scholars as discussants. I think we have some people who are. PK has also retired, I heard. Oh my God, I was saying some non-retired scholars. Doesn't matter. I think
So we have a new forum. We have a new forum we can set up easily now.
Yes.
So there is no retirement for scholars. Well, Sakshi, carry on, introduce them, and then manage the timing, okay? Or Manindra, what is the, Sakshi or Manindra? Yeah.
Yes, sir. So the first speaker today would be Professor Pradeep Datta. And so we're keeping, because of the positive time, we're keeping it to 7 minutes. Sorry.
7 minutes?
Yes, sir.
Sorry, I will exercise. I will exercise my.
No. I don't have much to say.
It should be at least 10 to 15 minutes. 10 minutes, make it 10 minutes to begin with.
Oh, okay, sir.
Please.
Yes, Professor Pradeep, you can begin. Sorry.
Thanks very much. Actually, I don't have that much to say. So I might even take less than 7 minutes. But thank you first, Sakshi and Maninder, for inviting me. And it's a great privilege, firstly, to greet and welcome Gurpreet to the Retiree Club, and for all the kind of contribution that she has made and which Professor Mohanty has outlined. And I heartily second that. And of course, the privilege of being with Professor Mohanty, whom I, as an insider-outsider to the discipline of political science, he's one of the people who actually inspired me to really think seriously and respect political ideas, whether it was embedded in the obvious form of concepts or in terms of practices. and this I had got from conversations, from stormy faculty meetings, from all kinds of sources, and it's been a very, and of course his own lectures, which has been, unfortunately I've never had the privilege of being taught by him, but I've heard him. So it's a great privilege to be with Professor Mohanty, who's had a tremendous contribution to make to Delhi University and to the university culture of Delhi, which I think is very important that this forum is here, because this has one problem that has bugged me continuously, is that we have some of the best universities in this city, some of the best scholars, and yet we are very sectoralized in our universities, and we hardly, very few initiatives are taken, except by, say Professor Monti or some others, and now this foundation. So thank you very much. So having just a few remarks on Gurpreet's, I'm more or less thinking with her rather than against her. One of the first things I think I should outline is the importance, historical importance of Gurpreet's work itself. Because I think in a way, Gurpreet's work breaks free, or was one of the first to actually break free from what I think is the long 19th century. And by that I mean this kind of creative obsession, I feel, creative obsession, though we don't recognize the creative part of it, with, on one hand, feeling that we are entrapped in colonial categories. And this is something I have seen from Bankim onwards, if not even earlier, Bhudev, Bankim in Bengal, and I'm sure many such instances are there in other parts of the country, in intellectual formations from the mid-19th to the late 19th and to the early 20th centuries, on one hand, and on the other hand, the search for uniqueness. Whether it's in origins, mainly, and it could be cultural origins, historical origins, it could be all kinds, but the notion of origins as in some ways being foundational to uniqueness. I think Gurpreet's work is one of the earliest to break free from these two and recognize also the creative power, which we haven't actually recognized, of this particular binary in which Indian political thinkers have functioned. In a way, it's been an entrapment, and I want to point out the paradox here. It's been an entrapment in these two categories of being entrapped in colonialism and trying to break free of it, and then trying to search for origins. The creative part, which I think has really, in a way, Gurpreet's work is one of the first to actually seize on that creativity, is the fact that this kind of struggle between sense of entrapment and sense of authenticity has also, at least from the mid 19th century, if not earlier, has also been very productive. It's been productive of a search for autonomy. And by autonomy, what I mean is not uniqueness so much as a sense of distinctiveness. And I want to make these difference between these two categories, because I think the idea of origins actually is complicit with the idea of entrapment. Because both of these tend to work together. If you're entrapped, you always look for freedom, and freedom is the opposite, binary opposite of entrapment, and you find it in origins. Whereas what these thinkers laid the foundations in their different ways, and which we need to kind of look at, and which I think Gurpreet's work is one of the first to do that, is to look at the distinctive qualities of Indian political thought as it has emerged. And I think Gurpreet's work is one of the first to kind of actually flag that and map that. One of the things that Gurpreet has suggested, and I want to also flag that off, is the idea of looking at it historically. And I think I agree with her, though I am also a partly trained historian, and I do subscribe to the power of historical causation and chronology and so on and so forth. At the same time, I think history is also a field of incredibly flexible practices. And a part of these is the destabilizing aspect of time, of change. The whole idea of history is posited on the notion of change, and especially of temporal change, without necessarily being causative in that temporality, but also the kind of difficult, negotiated, sometimes juxtaposed relationship between the past and present. So there is sometimes continuity, but there is also juxtaposition, there is negotiation, there are struggles. And, so history in that sense is also a field of very creative negotiations, juxtapositions. And I think in Indian history especially, this is very important because in a sense, as Indian historians, one of the kind of problems, which also in a way corresponds to some of the binary oppositions that we suffer from, is that unlike the West and the Western idea of history, and which also corresponds to political thought, there is this long, continuous, fictional evolution, uninterrupted evolution of Western history, from the Greeks to Enlightenment, and thence to modernity, and then to the overturning of that modernity through post-modernity, and so on and so forth. There is, you can see, or at least it's constructed in such a way. Whereas in Indian history, the construction has always suffered from the sense of breakage. And it's partly to do with our colonial kind of inheritance of breaking it up into classical, stroke ancient, then medieval, and then stroke modern, and so on and so forth. But we do suffer from a sense of breaks in Indian history. And this also results in the sense, in this commitment to finding continuities, which often leads to origins. Again, the struggle to get origins, to find continuities from the ancient past, and it could be the Vedic, could be the Buddhist, could be XYZ. And the challenge, it seems to me, is again to look at history in the sense that I think I was trying to extend Gurpreet's ways of looking at history as a creative kind of space in which you may transact with different concepts taken from different periods of time, from different traditions, from different notions of India itself. Because the idea of India, as it were, as a territorial unit, is something that really emerges in modernity, through the freedom struggle and so on and so forth. Whereas the India has, we have seen over the last 2,000 or 3,000 years, is an India that is, if we, retrospectively look back, is an India that has expanded, contracted, according to different categories. And it's never really coincided with the territory that we call India today, as it were. So that's a kind of another interesting challenge that we need to take up when we look at India and Indian politics. I hope I'm not taking up too much time. Am I taking up too much time, Sakshi? Otherwise, I'll just stop here.
So it's been more than the stipulated time, but it's okay.
Okay. So I'll just finish here, and thank you very much. I just want to
No. Take another 2 minutes. Sorry.
I just want to also just flag off the last point that Gurpreet made about the universal. I think there is a very rich history of the universal from the 19th century in modernity, starting from the Neo-Vedantic, but to also republicanism, to from Ramon Roy, and Ramon Roy in a way actually has a whole range, whole array of universals and universalisms that we actually see changing uh, in its shape and form through the course of the 19th century and through the 20th century. So universalisms is something that we again need to revisit as well. So again, I completely want to think with Gurpreet on that area. So thank you very much, Gurpreet, and to Sakshi, Maninder, and to Manu. Thank you.
I would now request the second respondent, Professor Anuradha Veeravali, to come and speak.
Yes, Anurag.
Thank you. Yeah. Um, Thank you so much. It's a privilege. And
I think a little introduction to Anuradha's works should have been there.
no, there's not much work. I've worked on Gandhi in political theory, trying to place him in what Professor Mahajan would call a universal and not a parochial point of view, to see how he responds to issues which have been formulated in universal terms. Um, uh, Thank you so much for your presentation and for the book. I think some fears and some difficulties that I have with Professor Mahajan's method of dealing with Indian thought, I will raise. I'm of course not a political scientist I have done some political theory. I'm a philosopher by profession. Well, one about this dichotomy between history and culture, and that history destabilizes, I understand, but what would it have to destabilize if there was not a tradition or a particular what you would call essentialist? I am not so sure that all tradition comes without a principle of motion within it, not necessarily as responding to history and circumstance, but in terms of fundamental differences that can posit themselves within a culture. I will explain what I mean by this thing. So, but yeah, so I think there is culture, history. I mean, they both need each other, because history cannot destabilize unless there is something to destabilize. The other problem I have is that I agree that many of the efforts to understand Indian political thought have been in the direction of returning to origins or presenting an authentic point of view, and not so much in terms of presenting a fundamentally different response to issues. Now, my one major fear was in some ways voiced by Professor Mahajan herself, when she said that it does not allow us to compete and contribute to the universal. So really, in this formulation of the problematic, it's as though we are today with a completely clean slate, where we have responded through experience, but no fundamental theoretical difference and no fundamental formulation of that difference. And I think that that would not be true, and it would not be true not only of specifically Indian point of view, but also the received Western point of view that we have has always had a fundamentally different non-dominant point of view in the West, which the West itself had forgotten and perhaps people like Gandhi, and more recently people like Professor Nandi and Professor JPS Oberoi have tried to formulate. So there is the other mind of Europe, which we need to contend with. So I think uh, when we have this understanding of history destabilizing, we have to have some parameters by which we are able to judge and measure what is at stake in dealing with what is there and in destabilizing it. So unless we have contending fundamentally different theoretical positions on this, I cannot see how there would be a meaningful progress of history. Now, let me just briefly explain what I would think is the universal bone of contention when we look at political theory. I think whether it is India or it is the West or the other West, the other mind of Europe, uh, the main contending points of view have been one uh, where conscience uh, dominates, or conscience and civil society have to determine the course of history. And the second, where power and the state have to determine the course of history. So whether it is Socrates' fight against the state, or it is Gandhi in his own way fighting British rule. I think these are the two main uh, contending positions which are at stake historically. And there I feel that both with respect to the other mind of Europe and this apparently essentialist point of Indian thought, what was done there is that there was an attempt to formulate the point of view of the politics of conscience. So I would hold, for instance, Plato's Republic as one attempt to discuss the foundations of a politics of conscience rather than of power. And Aristotle would be one who tried to counter the Republic's position with a politics of power. And I think that is a universal and eternal foundational debate that we will, and I think, for instance, the Shanti Parva and the Mahabharata present a politics of conscience. The entire discussion is about a politics of conscience and not of power. And perhaps one would say the same thing about Ram Rajya. So there are fundamentally different points of view, which where a lot is at stake in terms of the historical position and push that one point of view gets rather than the other. And this, I think, cannot. It would not be fair to put aside all of these debates under the carpet of essentialism or the banner of essentialism. So thank you, but these are problems that really I feel are of very serious consequence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those were really challenging questions, typical of the creative theory colloquium. Now, we have 20 more minutes. My suggestion would be to open it for further comments and then have Gurpreet and others to come back. Is that okay, or you want to have Gurpreet now, ideally, to respond to the comments first? Gurpreet, would you like to comment briefly first?
I can address at least a couple of issues that
Okay.
Anuradha has raised
All
because
right.
they may surface in other questions also.
All
So it
right.
might
All
be a good
right.
idea. And these are very fundamental questions. So let me just deal with them first. I think when I just flagged the idea that it's in the 19th century that the Western canon, or what is called Western political thought, is constructed, certainly there is selection here. So many important ideas and concepts don't find a place there. And this is something that internally in their discussions and debates, they come to realize. The second thing is that in terms of what you call the other, so there are many other traditions and many other important political ideas that are there in Europe, in Western thought, which didn't find a place in the canon. But having said that, I think the debate between power and conscience can be one of them, but there are many others that are equally significant in that tradition and perhaps even in our tradition. One instance is, what is more important, a life devoted to action or a life devoted to contemplation and understanding? And to me, I could present Plato and Aristotle in that mode. In the contemporary times, in which, of course, even people as remote as Spinoza are being invoked, there is this fundamental question of what does it mean to live in a world without, as it were, firm foundations, where individuals are free and therefore free to construct something else. So what kind of framework or structural elements are there within which we may act, or are we going to be moving in a world where there is complete only power, whoever wins and their worldview will emerge? So I think there are many issues. So I agree there is an others kind of Europe, and I think there are many other ways of representing that other Europe and key debates that are there. Perhaps that's his point, something that we can take when we are doing, because there are many kinds of activities we can engage in when we are doing Indian political thought or theory. And we could be really asking some of the same questions or some big questions which are very significant here, and say, how did we really represent them? And maybe they will also have a universal significance, and I'm sure they do. But on the second element, which I think is very important about the dichotomy, which I'm very insistent on, because this is an analytical dichotomy that I want to make, because every time we focus on the cultural, the push towards essentializing is far greater. And that is why I don't eliminate the presence of culture, because as you say, something has to be there, it is changing, but I want culture to be thought of. I don't want to use the word necessarily historicizing culture, but that's what it implies. You don't think of it as mere repetition of the same. So we need to work with a different notion of culture. And the other element is, I wanted to emphasize, if it didn't get communicated, this is a good opportunity to reiterate, that I do see ourselves inhabiting two particular elements, something that is there which appears to be, and I think PK is right in reminding us that this is something which is at contest, which is always being contested in India. It's very important about that which we regard to be culture and, continuous and so on and so forth. But there is this other dimension, the dual space is that of a historical time, of the ideas that have shaped the imagination in 18th, 19th, 20th century. And that's the other that I had in mind. And I think the historical is, to me, a way of thinking which allows you to inhabit both these spaces, rather than build an unbridged, a complete dichotomy that severs. It allows me to think of culture differently, but it also allows me to think in terms of inhabiting two spaces and therefore being open to those kinds of influences. But thank you for those comments. Now, I think there are many people who have written in the chat box. It's very difficult to read as I was speaking, and I'm not even sure I can understand if I can address all of them. So I don't know, what would you like me to do? Look at the chat box and see?
Ma'am, I could read them one by one if you'd like that better.
Whatever I can, I have the chat
Oh.
box now open.
Okay.
Oh gosh, there are so many. How can I address? But my thank you to everybody who has sent these nice warm greetings. Good to see so many people familiar and otherwise. Sorry, did not speak in Hindi, but I can speak in Hindi now. So if you have a question, maybe I can take from somebody who has a question in Hindi. That I can see. Smriti, I have a request. The idea of dual temporal space seems to be what feminists have been emphasizing as situatedness of this scholar. I'm not sure at all, Nita, that this is the same. Because there are feminists of many kinds, and situatedness is an idea that we find in many theories other than feminism. So situatedness is here. It can be subject situation, the situatedness. It can, that is your subject position or your structural position. And many will really be wanting to talk about it. The historical has an element of that, but I have in mind is certain ideas which prevail and are dominant in a given historical time. That's the kind of notion of history that I want to bring in, which is a little beyond merely situatedness. Okay, unlike the social structures of classical Athens, how social conditions in ancient India made political philosophy neither possible nor necessary. Well, we will leave Professor, so both we can talk about it another time. Professor Parekh's main point, and I don't want to talk about it here because he has published an article on the same thing more recently, where he is talking about normative political theory not being there. And I think his concern is not just with the classical element, but even with the contemporary. This is something, of course, where he has changed his position, but maybe unless both you have a particular, it appears parallel that a culture with a rich and critical tradition of philosophy have relative plural and it's like this, that there are now new works that are emerging, which are using texts, and rather mentioned, there are debates around Mahabharata have been used to construct the kind of, political philosophy that might emerge. Panchtantra has been used. So there are people now who are extracting or writing about these texts differently in order to highlight some elements of the political that is embedded in them. So maybe this is something that we haven't done sufficiently. We need to talk about. So both you have many more questions. I'm going to skip now.
Yes.
Middle class
No
and
problem.
ideologies. What can I say?
Thank you so much, ma'am.
Some oral questions.
Yeah, I think I might switch to that. Is there a relation between philosophy and Indian political theory? Of course. I don't think when we are doing Indian political thought or theory or whatever you want to call it, we are necessarily only focused on the political in the narrow sense of the term, because the phrase is political philosophy. We could be doing political philosophy. So I think all these dimensions of thought are deeply interconnected, and we can't. We do for disciplinary sake, for the sake of discipline, for manageability, because not easy to get expertise over everything. So disciplines have their concepts and they train people in that.
Gurpreet, Maninder raised his hand. So can we ask him?
Yes. Is anybody in constant?
Thank you, Professor Mahajan, for a brilliant exposition of the ideas that you're working on now, I guess. And we will have more time to discuss these things. I have just one small question. And when you are talking in terms of culture versus history, even if we talk of dialectics between culture and history, where do you place the classical philosophical traditions, which has been very rich in India? Surprisingly, when we talk about Indian political thought, we start with freedom movement. We don't go back. I mean, you mentioned about Panchtantra, people are reading now Panchtantra differently, or Mahabharata, some parts of Mahabharata. But what about the rich philosophical debates that we had within Jainism, within so-called Hindu traditions, which are not actually religious philosophical traditions? They are very secular, like Sankhya or Nyaya or others. How do we anchor our political theory in this intellectual tradition? And if we do that, would you call that cultural essentialism, or is that just looking for resources other than the available in the Western tradition?
It's like this. I think if our journey back is in terms of origins, then I think I would have much more concern about it. Okay, if we are looking and reading those texts as looking for origins of the ideas that we want to inhabit today. But if, on the other hand, we want to take, and this is what I assume Professor Mohanty had in mind when he talked about history of knowledge being there the world over with all civilizations and groups and people, is the idea that certain kinds of questions, maybe not all, but there are specific questions which different groups of people and civilizations engaged in. So we might ask, what was that particular kind of question that is central at this time? Or rather suggested maybe it's a question about consciousness versus power and authority. Maybe it's a different question about really dealing with plurality. And how do we deal with that? It may be a question about the nature of truth, and then we might say, where is that truth going to be anchored in, and who really is in possession of that truth, and how do we deal with it? So I think it is in terms of not looking for origins, but saying what kinds of questions were these people engaged in, and surely those questions could have in a relevance which exceeds and goes far beyond that historical moment in time. And there is that element, but I wouldn't be so concerned about either going back there because there are origins or because we said it first or whatever. But I think there can be modes of thinking which are exceedingly important about dealing with the totality in which we inhabit and which is the core. After all, the question of justice that we want to deal with without going back into origins is fundamentally a question about our relationship. Who matters more? My family, the people within my city, my nation, the world. And surely, how do we think of ourselves in relationship to these kinds of totalities of very significant concerns, even much before the present movement? So I think instead of just saying that, let me find these connections there, etc., I might actually see what questions they were interested in. And I think there will be a great deal of knowledge and wisdom that we can imbibe and get from there. I'm not the best person to do that, but I'm sure they, others are. Maybe you are better at doing this and others can. But certainly, I think that's the quest. That is something that we should do. And I think that's what has taken people to read some of the classical texts differently.
Thank you very much. Akanksha Pathak. Akanksha.
Yeah, good evening, ma'am. It's good to see you. I had this question that if you are, I hope I'm audible.
Yeah, you are audible.
Okay. So I had this question that if we are talking about locating ourselves within history as historical actors, within a historical context, which I sort of I'm sympathetic to that kind of thinking, but I'm not able to reconcile it with the idea of also participating in the universalism, because if the historical mode of explanation is about how something happens, which it becomes particular for every entity, which is true for us in the post-colonial context, but it is also true of the West, so rather than feeling anxious about participating in the universal, isn't it better that we also sort of particularize the hegemonic claims of the West? And I think
Okay, it's clear. Gurpreet, just hold on. Let's take a couple of more questions. Supriya.
Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for this enlightening session. Just thinking with what you are saying, I found a kind of similarity between what you were saying and what Dipesh Chakrabarty does in provincializing Europe. I mean, the dialectics that you're mentioning between central modern ideas seems to me somewhat more towards history one, and the creative mediated pass towards history two, to find specifics. So is there some relationship, or is there some continuity with that work? Between a structure finding mode and a specific finding mode.
Okay, got it. Manika.
Hello, ma'am. Very good to see you again. I'll just read out my question for the fear that I might mess it up when I speak it independently. So I was just saying that while I completely agree with you that we inhabit a particular age and that centers certain concepts and problems that we are dealing with and would want to seek answers to, I think the reason why people are, why people look towards their own context and try to look at certain questions is because our present already is shaped by certain hegemonic discourses. So, for instance, rights, etc. So, how do we overcome then the very determination of the questions that we are asking
Okay.
by virtue of, yeah. Okay.
So, Gurpreet, why don't you answer these three?
Of course, all very fundamental questions. Thank you very much for all these questions. Let me take up a couple of things. I'm not going to address this issue of Dipesh's writings or my writings. I think it is for you to judge and see. I think we have both worked independently. If our paths are coming together, I'm very happy. And if Dipesh was here, I would certainly address that issue, but we'll leave that aside. The other issue, I think the one which is coming up over and over again, because concepts have a meaning and a history also. So every time we use them, they are suggesting to your mind certain ideas. And if I want you to not associate them with certain ideas, I should also clarify. And I think Anuradha flagged this also first, and then Akansha, and in some ways Monica too, which is that when we are talking about the historical, often we are thinking about the uniqueness of the present moment, of the moment in which this is said or done. Therefore, you are thinking in terms of whether it is determination or the question or concern that is there at this time. And therefore, we think its relevance is only for that moment. And I think one of the things we need perhaps also to recognize that while our actions may be shaped in this sort of way of finding what is relevant for that particular moment in time, reflective capacities are not similarly shaped. They may deal with a question that emerges at a given moment in time, but they may be thinking in terms of how do we respond to them without necessarily saying, well, will this yield the outcome I wanted to yield at a given moment in time? So that's one thing that I want you to keep in mind. The other element really of the historical that I wanted you to keep in mind is the idea that things change. The primacy of change is the idea I want you to take from the historical rather than anything else. Can the historical lead me towards the universal? I think yes, it does. You begin, your thought focuses on, and I think political thought again is a reflection on our human condition, on the things that that face us and confront us. But some of those issues and dilemmas really connect with people in similar situations and even beyond, in terms of how there are visions, because political thought also, there is vision about the future, there are utopias, there are ways of dealing with, as I said, connections between individuals and the larger groups and the world as a whole. So there are various elements that are there which take you beyond this. So being historical does not confine you to say that this is only relevant for this moment and I have to throw it in the dustbin immediately after. Because we live in that moment, we begin asking questions there, but what we envision by way of response may be dealing with that issue, but may actually be reflecting on something larger, which may not be realizable then, but in the future. And I think some of the grand political thought has had, well, philosophy, political, sociological, whatever, has had that particular dimension. So hold on to that. How am I going to displace the hegemony of the dominant discourses at this time? Because they will throw up contradictions with my own experience. And those contradictions will help me to say, let me push this forward, let me set this aside, take up another idea, or move in a different direction. And I think the impetus for change also comes in through this creative tension. I wanted to use that word in the end. So creative tension between the idea and the lived reality. And that's the reason why I focused on idea, because thoughts can be utopian and thought can have that dimension. And usually political thought has always had a political utopia dimension to it. And that's been its strength and so on. But when it comes to ideas, you can say the circulation of ideas, they're being absorbed a certain time, being discarded at another. And that allows you to see this movement. And then when you see similar kinds of tensions emerging, you can understand how this is not going to be really constrained by or determined by the hegemonic discourses.
It's 18 hours.
Okay. Sorry, my computer said that. I didn't.
Oh.
Now, sorry, we might spill over by a few minutes. May I request Pradeep, Pikedat, and Anuradha to make a short 2-minute reflection on the whole exercise? PK?
Anuradha may
Okay,
want to,
Anuradha.
because, yeah.
Okay, Anuradha. Anuradha, would you like a 2-minute reflection on our whole session?
18 hours for her.
Okay.
So, as usual, the creative theory sessions are provocative and exceptionally inspiring in times where there's very little food for thought around us in many ways. So I'm really grateful to Professor Mahajan, Professor Maninder for having invited me, and Professor Mahanti. The real spirit
Okay. I wanted,
Thank you so much.
because it's a very serious and very, very important occasion on which, it has triggered many trends of thought. PK, yes.
Yeah, just to flag off 2-3 quick things. One is, I think the culture history binary could actually be destabilized. I mean, they need to be interpenetrative rather than, a simple binary opposition. And I think that is one. And that would be far more fruitful, I think. The second is culture itself. In terms of being creative, there's another way of thinking about culture, which is also part of that creative process. It goes back to this discussion between Raymond Williams and E.P. Thompson of culture as a way of life and culture as a way of struggle. And I think that also is very important for us to think about Indian political thought and culture, because not all Indian political ideas fuse. And I have a bit of a problem there. There are gaps, there are often conflicts, unbridgeable conflicts, because sometimes the making of a democracy can also lead to its unmaking. And there are also things that we have that we've also seen in ourselves. I think these are the two things that I thought I would like to flag off. And thank you very much again for this wonderful session, and thanks again to Gurpreet.
Thank you. Anybody else? Maninder, would you like to? I will take a minute or two. Yeah.
Please, you continue, sir. I think.
Okay.
Professor Mahanti, if I may, as an afterthought, take a minute.
Yes.
No, just about this, this idea that tradition, as it were, is something that is essentialized and not, where there is no movement. I think even for someone giving a cursory glance, I would see, like, for instance, between the I think even traditionally between the Ramayana and Mahabharata, there is a sort of healthy debate about whether the Ramayana tends towards resolving issues, whereas the Mahabharata tries to bring fights into the family, as it were. But I think that even in terms of movement, if I see that between the Mahabharata and Gandhi is trying to build a politics of conscience where all war has been set aside. So in his commentary on the Mahabharata, he's actually against war, and he's bringing in the position of non-violence. So there is a principle of motion, even in a very sort of cursory glance at tradition. So thank you.
Actually, Gurpreet, focus on this. One thing about history is change. That applies to traditions also. Okay, I will say only two things. One is, I have always felt that there are two constraints in sort of discerning traditions of knowledge. One is the colonial constraint, and we know more about that. The other is the Brahminic constraint. The arrogance to say that these are the categories, this is the method, these are the texts, these are the scriptures, so and so you are a Dalit or a Brahman or whatever. You cannot have that capacity. It's that very important point. The reflective capacity. The reflective capacity has been sought to be limited. One is by power domination, which we saw maximum in colonial and also in various class systems where there are all kinds of constraints on various other sections of society about knowledge and knowledge creation. That's why we have different kinds of education and so on. But the other is about the class of Brahmins, Mandarins, philosophers, theorists who arrogate themselves with the capacity that, this capacity has to be cultivated, and you haven't acquired this capacity, you have failed. You cannot acquire this knowledge. Now, when you emphasize the need to learn the language, practice the techniques, master the methodology, and so on, you have to say that everybody or a lot of people can break those barriers and do this. So, this is very important. The ability of the ordinary human to reflect and then grow and then become a specialist, but can see the history of that making of that mind, of that expertise. So the reflective capacity should not be arrogated to a class, an individual, or a section. So the colonial constant and the Brahminic constant, you see, and in study of Greek thought and so on, you have the Brahminic constant also. I mean, it's worsens in Europe. And in India, it is galore, the constants on cultivation of knowledge. These are the two. And Gurpreet provides us many, many ways to cope with these two kinds of constraints and open them up. And PK and Anuradha's questions and PK's illustrations of how this was done, a fresh understanding of culture, a fresh understanding of these dichotomies, a fresh understanding of this dual space. After all, we speak the English language. And if you just have a Samata Charcha or Nyaya Charcha and not equality discourse or a justice discourse, the whole terms become different. You have a great new world participating in the Samata Charcha who don't know English that much, you see. So, in fact, the little that I saw, the treatment of Tagore in Gurpreet, I think my understanding of Tagore is far more open. And this multiplicity of spaces interacting, the Vishwanida concept, the Vishwamanava concept, and the concept of, the rootedness and the tradition, culture, and history of so the openness and the rootedness. That's what PK was indicating. Therefore, how to come to terms with these constraints and open up new arenas to inquire, grasp, and engage in this knowledge and knowledge creation about ideas, thought, and philosophy of people and regions all over the world. And that is a way of making of global political theory, global political philosophy. World consists of regions. Global consists of interconnections across the globe. And therefore, very few people have started talking about African civilization, and very even fewer about African philosophy. And the title of that the first volume disappointed me. I think it's very important. And the anti-communist title that the Chinese professor had. But, you know, he cannot say that Chinese wouldn't have political philosophy. Of course, the political philosophy. But Middle Kingdom, you know, that's the last 200 years inheritance. Political philosophy of China, the Middle Kingdom complex, and so on. So, we have all these categories to battle with. And therefore, when democracy is our common pursuit in India, what is its history? I think Gurpreet has constructed it extremely well, giving us openings to pursue this further. So we are most grateful to Gurpreet for presenting this work and opening up many new areas of investigation. And thank you all very much.
Can I take a minute, Professor Mohanty?
Yes.
First, of course, thank you so much for inviting me. This is my first really foray into this forum, and it's been a very rich and interesting discussion. I'm grateful to everybody who was here, who sent. Before I log out, I will look at the chat carefully to see the questions that were asked. So thank you for all that, and thank you, of course, to Professor Mohanty, who's always the big draw here. And to PK and Anuradha, I wanted to get their, sort of thoughts in and think about it. And there are many interesting ideas there. Though I must say that I am going to continue to insist that I was thinking of culture and history separately as modes of theorizing, not descriptions of what cultures are or what history is. And I think because when we adopt one mode or prioritize one over the other, it has pushed us actually in one direction. There are possibilities of escape within it, and that's why I'd like it to be changed differently, but it's been, thank you very much for this invitation. But I should conclude by drawing attention to one thing. Sakshi, I should correct what Sakshi said in the beginning by way of introduction. I am a retired professor living in Delhi, and only that I'm not currently anything. I'm just a retired professor. Okay. Lived in a different time. I may have been currently somewhere else or the other, but that I don't know. But that information was probably dated for a couple of years earlier. But just to set the record straight, I'm just a retired person here. I said professor because Anuradha mentioned Jeet and JP Sobra said the professor. They take the chair wherever they are. So, it's not a position that's going to be filled by others. So I'm assuming I can say still retired professor, even though I don't have an institutional affiliation. But thank you so much for this invitation.
Thank you very much.
For this discussion.
Thank you very much, Gurpreet. Before Sakshi says something, let me thank from the side of the Foundation for Creative Social Research. And as Sakshi has already announced, that this is a part of a series that we are going to organize, and next coming months probably we'll have more discussion on this theme, and we will probably be able to see Gurpreet more frequently on this very chaotic forum, which is not very organized and is outside the formal institutional framework, and we will have serious differences also discussed in this forum, I'm sure, in times to come. And Professor P.K. Datta and Anuradha have been visiting this forum every now and then. And I'm sure Sakshi will announce that this video has been recorded and it will be available on YouTube. People can raise questions there, and at some stage we'll request Gurpreet to come back and to carry on the debate if needed. Please, Sakshi, carry on. And thank you, Professor Mohanty. I'm just, despite all odds, you decided to stay here and kind of engaged in this kind of debate. I know how difficult it must have been for you to be here for so long. Thank you.
I'm going to be very quick. I would just like to take this opportunity to thank the chair, Professor Mohanty, the speaker, Professor Mahajan, and the respondents, Professor Anuradha Viravali and Professor Pradeep Kidutta, for the enthralling engagement. I would also like to thank the organization Foundation for Creative Social Research, which has made the Saturday seminar a possibility. We hope to see everyone in the audience and the speakers to be present for the next Saturday seminar too. Thank you.
Thank you
And
very
also,
much. Great.
thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh. So thank you. I'm just looking at the chat still because Aryamma had this name, which I was wondering who has this name rooted and something or the other. Hello, Aryamma. Subodh, I'm good to see people now. I'm seeing faces which I didn't earlier. Aryamma, I've seen his name now after a long time. He's still not to be seen, only rooted. Well. Well. Good to see you. Good to see you. Good to see everybody here. I wish one could see more faces, but then these are the constraints. But I'm just looking at the names. So thank you very much for all your inputs. And as I said, I look at the chat more carefully and see what is there. Yeah, Anita. Okay, good for you to turn on the thing because
I know it just distracts. But what is your latest email ID?
my latest email ID, Maninder has. Okay.
Okay,
So
I'll ask Maninder. Thanks.
I'm just saying that I'm really bad with typing. If I can, don't ask me difficult, long questions. It is difficult, but we can have a chat.
No difficult. I did a PhD eventually.
I can certainly talk on the phone more easily than I'm just resting my hands. That's all, my hands.
Okay. लेकिन number कहाँ पे मिलेगा?
Maninder से ले लेना, Sakshi से ले
लेना. Okay, I'll ask Sakshi.
All right. Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay, folks. Bye-bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.